Hi everyone, I am getting ready to do the second lecture, and I've had to give up my dream of orienting the class around case studies so that I can actually get it done. I just wasn't prepared to get so sick. I had no idea. I've never had pneumonia before, and I'm still really wiped out, and I'm also taking care of my daughter and her friend because I'm doing summer camp for them. And I just am not going to get it done the way I wanted to. So I'm very sad. But I'm going to go back to my traditional way, which is pretty similar. But I'm going to go through the chapters in the boring way, like I normally do, like you'd normally see in a class. So basically we'll do a chapter each lecture, except for next lecture. In lecture 3, we'll do 2 chapters. So we'll be caught up. So basically the lecture numbers will correspond to the chapters. So when we get to exam 1, it'll cover chapters 1 through 3. Again, the focus will be on lecture 1 through 3. If you want to, study for the material from the book or kind of reinforce what I've talked about, you can take the chapter quizzes if you want for extra credit. You don't have to know everything in the book for the exam. What you need to know, if it hasn't come out of my mouth, it's not going to be on the exam, but the quizzes certainly won't hurt. So they cover more than you need to know, but they do cover also what we're covering in class. So we're going to start with chapter 1, and I'll skip over what the stuff I already tied into the Brock Turner case, and there'll still be written assignments. I'm just not going to try and focus it on case studies. I was working on school segregation, and I just realized if I'm going to try and get it done on time, I'm going to have to get my act together. So here we go, chapter 1. So we're going to start with some terms. Okay, so our brains like to be right. Okay, we know that when we are right, when we feel right, we get good stuff in our brain, right? We get rewards, we get serotonin, and life feels good. And when we're wrong or unsure, we get bad things, right? We're evolved to not like uncertainty. We're evolved to not like being wrong. And so when we feel like we know what's going on, it feels better. And this can kind of get in the way of learning, right? So it's good to be aware of it kind of going in. And if you think about the last time you were in an argument with someone and how right you are and how wrong they are, that feeling, that's the kind of chemical explosion that we're talking about. So since our brains like to be right, and we're not always right, our brain does some things to help us feel right, maybe even when we're not. And so we're going to talk about some biases and some kind of brain stuff that we do that relates to trying to learn sociology, because sociology brings up stuff that can be difficult and vexing, and it can go against what we believe and what we would believe to be true. I had this really funny experience a couple weeks ago talking to my stepfather, who's almost 90, and he really, really believes that people who smoke marijuana are likely to end up addicted to heroin. And, the more I said, the more he just thought I was ridiculous. My mom, who's 80, in her 70s, smoked marijuana. She decided to try it with her friends a few times. And I was like, okay. And my mom was like, well, the stuff I smoked wasn't that strong, you know, so she wasn't smoking the heroin inducing marijuana. So anyway, but he was really clear that he was right. And one of the ways that we kind of go about our day and make ourselves right is by having a series of paradigms. And a paradigm is a framework, right? It's a belief system, and it kind of allows us a way to view the world. And I always think of it like a picture frame. And when you look through a picture frame, by definition, some of the things that you focus on because now they're in the frame, and other things that are outside the frame you tend to ignore. And when we have a paradigm, we tend to hold on to it pretty tightly. And even when conflicting data that goes against what we're seeing in the middle of the frame kind of hits the outside of the frame, we tend to ignore it or not pay attention to it because we're attached to that viewpoint in our frame. And sometimes we have what's called a paradigm shift. And a paradigm shift is when you change your paradigm. And these paradigm shifts can be huge, like the paradigm shift between thinking whether the sun goes around the earth or the earth goes around the sun, right? Or, maybe you are in a relationship with someone and it turns out that this person is a liar, right? And maybe the first time they lie, you just kind of write it off and think, and don't really think about it. And then the second or third time, and then, you kind of, and eventually you may make the shift that this person is just not to be trusted and is just not going to make it. When I first became a foster parent, I was really clear with my daughter's biological mother, who we have a relationship with, that I was going to be able to get her and her family out of poverty. And, they live in the underclass. They're very poor. Nobody works. Nobody has a high school diploma. Everybody's income, if they have an income, comes from disability or food stamps, or, they never have any money. Everybody's always in crisis. And, I was just really clear that I could fix this. And, I went in and one of the first things I did was I offered anybody who got their GED $500. $500 is a huge amount of money in their world. There go my dogs. It's a huge amount of money in anybody's world, but especially in their world, right? And 8 years later, nobody's taken me up on it, right? And at some point, I had to make the shift that no matter what I did, I wasn't going to be able to fix the problem. And offering the GED was just one of a billion things that I tried to do to help them get out of poverty. And crazy thing, money and all kinds of things that I tried to do. And eventually I had to realize I'm not going to be able to fix this problem. And it was a very painful experience for me. And that's a paradigm shift that took me a long time to make. So another concept is cognitive dissonance. And cognitive dissonance is a state in our brains of discomfort. So our brains are in a state of discomfort. And it comes from having two or more beliefs or behaviors or thoughts that conflict. So you, like I was talking earlier about the cell phone. So we all believe that we're good people, and good people don't put other people's children at risk intentionally. Okay, so that's true. And I don't think there's anybody who would argue that that's not true, that if you're a good person, you don't put other people's children at risk unnecessarily. That's true. And most people talk on the cell phone when they drive. And those two things don't go together. When you talk on the cell phone, you're putting other people's children at risk. You're putting other people at risk too. You're putting yourself at risk, but you're putting other people's children at risk, right? Your car becomes much more dangerous to other people when you're talking on your cell phone. So cognitive dissonance is that state where we're like, that's uncomfortable, yeah. And kind of how do we deal with it? And we have different ways of dealing with it. And one really common way is just not think about it. I usually, when I talk about it on the first day of class, people are like, oh, that's horrible, I'll never do it again. And, within a week, I'll ask and everybody's forgotten about it. And sometimes people get really agitated and they feel like, well, I'm able to drive and talk on my cell phone without, causing harm. And I had one woman say, well, what if it's an emergency? And I was like, well, what does a texting emergency look like, right? I mean, when is it an emergency that you have to text while you're driving? But those were, they were trying to get out of the state of cognitive dissonance. Another example of cognitive dissonance is that, we teach our kids about the happy animals on the farm, and, the chickens and the cows and the, and then on the other hand, we raise the meat that we eat, the animals that we kill for meat, in horrible, torturous conditions. Nobody can say they're anything but torture chambers, and animals die, screaming in fear. And I saw something today that a hamburger from a fast food restaurant can have, meat from, dozens of animals in it. And I was just like, oh my God. So the fact that, we eat meat and we care about animals, nobody wants to see an animal get hurt. None of us would torture an animal, but we allow animals to be tortured on our behalf, right? And that feeling that I eat meat, animals are tortured, it can be a state of cognitive dissonance. Okay. And then there's something called the backfire effect. And the backfire effect is a phenomenon where if someone has a deeply held belief and you present them with information that contradicts this belief, instead of considering the belief, like taking the belief out and examining it with this new information, taking the new information into consideration, what they will tend to do is instead is they'll tend to go deeper into their own belief system. So like I was talking about the conversation I had with my stepfather, where he started out believing that most people who try marijuana end up on heroin, and at the end of the conversation, despite the facts that I'd given to him, he was more convinced that it was true and angry at me. Right? So the backfire effect is why postings on Facebook don't change anybody's mind. People aren't really interested in data in terms of political beliefs. Political beliefs are paradigms, and we look for information that confirms our belief system, which leads us to the confirmation bias. And the confirmation bias is the bias of attention, as is the Bader-Meinhof phenomenon. And the confirmation bias is that we tend to pay attention to data in our world that confirms what we already believe. And we tend to pay less attention to data that doesn't confirm what we already believe. So if you believe that, there's a certain, like I have this insane belief about young men driving black BMWs. I don't know why. I'm just always, I just think they're horrible, aggressive, obnoxious, rude drivers, right? It's a total stupid prejudice that I have, but I really have it. Like, they're just, ugh, right? I want to kill them. And not really. And so when I see someone in a black BMW, I see a young man in a black BMW cut someone off or drive aggressively or do something like that, I'll be like, see, there you go. And when I see someone driving a black BMW, a young man, and he's driving nicely, I don't pay any attention to it. Or when I see another kind of car cut someone off, I don't use that as a classification of that kind of car, right? So I pay attention to what confirms what I already believe. This is how horoscopes work, right? Horoscopes are not valid. They have no basis in any kind of science. They're made up. They're old, but old doesn't mean valid. They have no basis in reality. Sorry, but where the stars were when you were born does not make you stubborn. But people have a belief system, a paradigm about a particular horoscope. So if you have a friend and they're a Taurus and you see them do something, you'd be like, oh, look at them. What a Taurus. And there was research done where they put a bunch of people in a room and they asked them their star sign, and then they handed them a sheet that described their star sign and asked them to rate how closely it matched their personality. And everybody thought that, it was a pretty good description of who they were. And everybody had been given the same sheet, the same description. So what we do in horoscopes is when there's information that fits, we pay attention to it. And when there's information that doesn't work, we just don't pay attention to it. We just ignore it. So we confirm what we already believe. The fundamental attribution error and the actor-observer bias I already talked about. And the fundamental attribution error is that we tend to, all right, dogs. We tend to explain other people's bad behavior based on fixed character traits, and rather than looking at circumstances. And we tend to explain our own bad behavior not by looking at fixed character traits, but by looking at our circumstances. I'm really sorry about the dogs. My daughter and husband just came home, and they weren't supposed to come home yet. So this means that we put our own behavior in a context, but we don't do that with other people. So if I cut someone off in traffic, I think I said before, it's because someone was pushing me over and I had to, or I'd get into an accident. If someone else does it, it's because they're obnoxious and have a black BMW. So we judge people's behavior more harshly than we judge our own, and we don't tend to see ourselves as having bad character traits. We see ourselves as being in difficult circumstances, right? So if we're late, it's because of traffic. And then the last bias is called the Bader-Meinhof phenomenon. And the Bader-Meinhof phenomenon is like the confirmation bias about attention. And it means that if we, when we learn a new concept or a new term, then suddenly we start to see it everywhere, right? So you may find that as you learn things in the class, that you'll suddenly start to see them, right? When I first learned the term Bader-Meinhof, I suddenly started to see Bader-Meinhof appearing out in the world, or I'd read it in a book. And I'd be like, hey, I know what that means. So Bader-Meinhof is, again, a focus of attention. I mean, a bias of attention. These things are not, it's not that the whatever is appearing more often, it's just that your attention is primed to see it. So it's like if you decide on a baby name, you'll suddenly hear that name, or if you buy a certain car, you'll see it everywhere. So those are some of the phenomenon and biases that I want you to have for going forward. And what I'd like you to do for the written assignment is to pick 3 of the biases phenomenon and give us an example from your own life. A real example, a specific example, right? Not just a general example, but a specific example. So I give you an example of the confirmation bias of my not liking young men in black BMWs. So, for example, or like the cognitive dissonance of eating meat and caring about animals. So, or the backfire effect from talking to my stepfather. So you can give it a try and list 3 and write your own examples. And that's the end of video 1.